Good evening. My name is Rachel Aliff, and I am the chair of this year's last lecture committee.
And my name is Maggie Shawley, and I'm the vice president of this year's Mortar chapter.
We would appreciate it if you turned your cameras on. We are honored to partner with the Humanities Center to hold this event. Thank you, Humanities Center. We are so excited to introduce our speaker tonight. But first, let me give you a little background about our chapter of Mortarboard so you know who we are and what we do. Mortarboard is a national honor society that recognizes college seniors for distinguished achievement in scholarship, leadership, and service. Mortarboard began in 1918 as the first national organization honoring senior college women. It was open to men in 1975, but it still preserves its goal to promote and advance the status of women and is also focused on promoting equal opportunities among all people. Overall, Mortarboard members have a lifetime commitment to the ideals of scholarship, leadership, and service.
The USD Mortarboard chapter was founded in October 2000 by Judith Lewis Lowe. This past fall, we celebrated our 20th anniversary and renamed our chapter the Judy Lewis Lowe Alcala chapter of Mortarboard. The National Mortarboard Leadership Award awarded our chapter the Ruth Weimer Mount Award for Chapter Excellence in 2006, awarded to the best Mortarboard chapter in the country. Every year since then, our chapter has been recognized as one of the top chapters, an honor which we are proud of and strive to continue.
Mortarboard began hosting the Last Lecture Series event at USD in the fall of 2010. The series is inspired by Dr. Randy Pausch's last lecture at Carnegie Mellon on the topic of achieving your childhood dreams. Dr. Pausch delivered this lecture while terminally ill, making it his genuine last lecture. Thankfully, our speaker is healthy and well. We continue this tradition so that distinguished faculty can convey their thoughts and wisdom pertaining to a topic of their choosing. USD Mortarboard members select a favorite and inspiring faculty member to consider what they would say if they were giving their last lecture.
This year's chapter of Mortarboard is prioritizing work on inclusion, diversity, and equity. To that end, we created an Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Committee with 2 vice president positions to lead it. Please welcome Maya, one of our committee vice presidents, to lead us in the land acknowledgement.
Hi, everyone. So I typically like to start with a quote from Dr. Mark Rose to discuss why we do land acknowledgements and why they're important. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognize the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. And since this meeting is being held online, a singular land acknowledgement can't capture the richness of our distribution across the US and across the globe. So since our chapter of Mortarboard is a body under the University of San Diego, I would like to share the land acknowledgement that is used at USD, since USD does inhabit the Kumeyaw land. I want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaw Nation. I want to pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaw Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. Examine your own positionality with regards to where you find yourself today, and not let this conversation stop when this land acknowledgement ends.
All right, so now I am honored to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. T.J. Tallie. Dr. T.J. Tallie earned his bachelor's degree in history and the study of religion from University of California, San Diego. He then obtained his Master of Arts in History from University of California, San Diego. Finally, he received his PhD in History from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
Dr. Tallie is admired by his students and is an incredibly engaging professor in the range of courses he teaches at USD. Maj, would you like to share your experience about having Dr. Tallie as your professor?
Yes, of course. It would be a pleasure. Dr. Tallie is truly an angel in human form. He is one of the most understanding and enthusiastic professors I've met during my time at USD, to say the least. I first came to know him during the USD Summer Research Colloquium, during which he selflessly offered to advise me on my architecture research. What I love about Dr. Tallie is that since the first day I met him, he has never been afraid to speak the truth and call out injustice when he sees it. He is carefree, and thanks to him, I've learned wonderful variations for the word pandemic, such as personal pan pizza and Panera bread. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to take class with him, I'm sorry, but you are seriously missing out.
I'm currently taking an advanced integration class that is paired with Dr. Tallie's class. So I'm really excited to start working with his History of South Africa class, just putting that out there. barely not missing out. Dr. Tallie is passionate about South African history, gender and sexuality, settler colonialism in the 19th century, Zulu language and culture, British imperialism, global indigenous studies, and queer theory. He is excellent at creating a welcoming environment, effectively teaching students how to think critically about important topics, and is one of the most fun professors at USD. Dr. Tallie's scholarly work specifically focuses on the 19th century African colony of Natal. He wrote a book about his studies in the area called Queering Colonial Natal, Indigeneity and the Violence of Belonging in Southern Africa. And we very much recommend the read. Okay, so clearly Dr. Tallie is impressive, but we're not done.
Dr. TJ Tallie has a current research project tentatively titled Conjugal States, where he looks at the concept of monogamy in relation to the idea of white settler reproduction in British Columbia, New Zealand, and South Africa in the context of the incipient threat of polygamy practiced by the emergent Latter-day Saint movement in the 19th century Utah. He hopes to be able to provide others with a history of sexuality, settler colonialism, and indigenous people that charts varied forms of Native resistance to settler incursions. Dr. Tallie is beyond interesting, and we are so excited to hear him present today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. TJ Tallie.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Thanks so much. Also, Maggie, I'm super thrilled. It was sort of hilarious because I saw your name and I was like, oh, I know that she's working on a landform with me. So I'm very glad to see you. I'm glad you're here. We're gonna talk about South Africa real soon next week. Oh my gosh, thank you. I am really nervous despite being 37 years old and owning a PhD. I don't understand why I feel this nervous, but I am so thrilled to be here. I wanna thank Mortar Board. I wanna thank Rachel for her constant sort of presence and advisement. I wanna thank Brenda Meyer. I wanna thank also the Humanities Center and the Last Lecture Series in general. So I do have a few caveats just for you brilliant wizards of knowledge and learning who are joining me from wherever you're joining me. One thing that we're going to do today is we are going to talk about difficult subjects. We will talk about historical violence. We will talk potentially about things that may be traumatic or triggering. And so I just wanted to let you all know that that will be things that we'll discuss, historical violence and marginalization. The other thing is that, and if you've had me before in a class, you know this, and I will give you this caveat always, I am an adult, but barely. Hence, I look like if Mr. T were the mayor of Candyland, as I've said before. But one of the things that I do as an adult is that I talk about difficult and complicated things. And as a consequence, I need you to know right now, there will be swear words. I will use grown adult swear words. So it will not be the entire thing. It will not be like a pirate sea shanty, but I need you to understand that if that is going to be problematic for you, you need to know heads up that there will be some swear words in this. I feel it's more important to discuss types of structural marginalization and be okay with four-letter words rather than be polite and sort of shy away from that violence. So a bit of heads up on how this is going to be. This is going to be roughly about a 50-minute lecture, God willing. And I will make sure we leave some time at the end if you've got questions or freakouts or comments. And there's 3 sections. The first section is the longest. So if we get through the first section, you're like, oh my God, no, this is comparatively much longer. So, all right, let's get started. We all ready, sweet babies? We gonna get it together? Okay. So first off, today's talk is called Long Shadows, How the Past Shapes Our Challenges, Our Belonging, and Our Hopes. Whew. All right, let me get into it with you all. So first off, what we need to know is doing a last lecture as an anxious person is an entire series unto itself. For those of us who are familiar with the last lecture series, it is all following the footsteps of Randy Pausch, who was a computer scientist who did incredible work. And then upon hearing in 2006 that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, in the remaining year as a professor, really endeavored to sort of put together what his last sort of structural ideas and concepts would be. And so this was memorialized in the 2012 book Last Lecture. And if you've had a chance to see Randy's incredible final lecture, it's mind-blowing and it's incredibly important. I need you to also understand by this juxtaposition, his is more awesome, right? But I am gonna try my level best today. One of the things we're gonna be talking about first off is when I was told that students had wanted me to give this talk, I was honored and I was terrified, right? It's a sort of honor to be seen and recognized by students as somebody who does some sort of impact and makes a difference. And that's fantastic. Also, for those of you who know me personally, I am a deeply anxious person. If I seem sort of clever or comedic or on point, thank you. That's actually comedic timing that's based about being highly anxious all of the time. And so it's this tenseness that is just focused right here. So I had to get into a mindset when I started to write this lecture, which involved having to think, what would it be like if I found out that I was dying? Now, granted, you don't theoretically have to do that, but I thought it would give me the right mind space to do this. It was very difficult. And for me, one of the things I started to do was to think, what are the important things I do in this life? What about this job matters to me? Why should anyone care about what I do? And so this is what really began to put this together. And so the lecture that comes out of this is sort of a multiple points of, you let an anxious person begin to contemplate their own mortality and then think, if I have to give one last thing to all of you, this is what it would be. So here we go. So again, Long Shadows today is thinking about the ways in which history impacts, intersects, reflects, and shapes our lives and why we should care. And so to do that, I need you to go on a little bit of a journey with me and understand how I got to do what I do, right? So a few things, for those of you who know me, this should be familiar. For those of you who do not, welcome, right? But this is a chance of understanding why I do the ridiculous things that I do. Now, here we go. Who is this guy anyway? Oop, going back. Who is this guy anyway? First off, the real questions to be asking are, why do I do this? Why history? Why does this matter? And why belonging, right? These are critical things that I really care about. I also realize that I'm now wearing the exact same outfit. Oh, wow. But why do I do this? I do this work because I think that history is transformative and meaningful. History is not just memorizing Eli Whitney Cotton Gin 1793. It's not a series of sort of dead facts or concepts. It is instead a living record of who we are and how we understand our relationship to ourselves and to each other more broadly. And so that's the work we're trying to do here. And so I'm shaped myself in my own personal journey and my own personal story by some of these aspects. So to understand that, you have to know some things about me. So here we go. Multiple aspects of me. First off, I have multiple forms of identity, as do all of you, and I want to think about how they shape this. I am a Black person. I identify as a queer person. I was raised evangelical in Southern California. I am a Southern California. I was raised on the indigenous lands of the Tongva people in Los Angeles. I am from the South Bay of Los Angeles, which is simultaneously the best and least interesting part of Los Angeles City, and I'm very glad to be from there. My work is shaped significantly as an undergraduate at the University of California, San Diego. I studied abroad in South Africa, and that blew me away. It made me think really complex and terrifying thoughts about settlement, about colonial violence, about history, and about who we are. I do have a hearing impairment. So I actually lack about a third to almost a half of the hearing in my right ear, and I always have. It's congenital. And so one of the things that my body did to compensate was that it rapidly tried to process language as a way of sort of being able to take it in. And so this actually means that I am one of those people that try to learn as many languages as possible. I speak 6 languages. If you've taken me for classes here at USD, you know that I make you learn some aspects of isiZulu. And I'm a big believer that if we are going to do African historical work, we have to make ourselves uncomfortable enough to live and act and be linguistically sort of fluid. Africans were forced to learn European languages, and the least we can do to honor that is to also be uncomfortable in our learning, okay? I'm an Aries. I need to say that because every person that is an Aries is contractually obligated to say that. We are the most important. And so part of this is that I think that's actually deeply important for being a professor, is that there is a mix of deep urgency and narcissism that shapes being a professor. You must simultaneously believe that the work you're doing is important and also that it is challenging and significant. Also, Rachel, you are correct. Arieses are the best. The final thing is that you all must know is that I am barely a grown-up. I 100% feel like this is all a scam and that I am tricking all of you into thinking that I am somehow mature enough to have this job. One day you will all realize this and you will take it back. But for now, haha, the joke is on you. So join me for all of this. Let's see if we can get through this. So, long shadows, my dear wizards. What we're doing here is we're thinking about connection and causation. We're thinking about why history matters, how it plays out in our lives. And fundamentally, the question that we will do to think about this is that we'll ask, how did we get here? How do we still live here? What does this look like? And if you had told me at any point in my life that I would quote William Faulkner, I would have slapped you because I am not a fan. But I've always loved this quote from him, so I will take it from him and giggle. But one of the things that I love that Faulkner said in the 1950s is, the past is never dead. It's not even past. And I think that those of you who are not lucky enough to be history majors, I'm so sorry. But for those of us who do history work, we don't just learn old-timey things and feel fancy in the past. I mean, that's part of it. But what we do is we understand how the past is continuously interacting with our present. The past is never done. When people say, why don't they just get over it? There's no getting over anything. We live in these historical moments that shape who we are simultaneously today. And if you've been in one of my classes, you know that's something that I urge you to continuously understand. The past is constantly playing in our everyday existence. And what history is as a discipline is not memorizing things from the past, but rather it is constantly how the past is refracted in our daily present. History matters because we are always looking through what has happened before to explain now. And it will always be different. As new events occur, we shuffle things in new ways, right? We now understand things, our way of thinking about and understanding history has been shaped by 14 months of a global pandemic and widespread incompetence and selfishness that have sort of manifest as ways in which people continue to make this worse than it needed to be. And so we will think about how history continuously plays out. And so I want us to think about that as we think about these long shadows. So for me, once again, I said that today's talk was how the past shapes our challenges, our belonging, and our hopes. And so here we go, sweet babies. We're doing the challenges section. There are 3 parts to the challenges section. If you've had me before, some of these will be very familiar. No, you may not, fast forward, you just gotta live with it. So our challenges today, our 3 sections are going to be as follows. First off, we're gonna talk about race, racism, and anti-Blackness. Second, we're going to call what I love to call settler colonialism, or a vast superstructure of fuckery, which is truly the best way to describe the world upon which we live. And finally, queerness and hierarchies of sexual value. Now, I want to be very clear, my sweet wizards, is that when I say these are our challenges, I do not mean these to be exhaustive, right? I'm not saying these are the only challenges facing society. Please don't go home and be like, Professor Tallie said, there are only 3 problems. No, these are, this is one lecture. Also, I cannot do all of the things, right? So I thought that 3 things that we would begin to tackle and things that are most important to me in my work and my existence are these, thinking about these sort of 3 things that play out. So let's get it together and go on this journey. All right. First, one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to talk about histories of race, racism, and anti-Blackness. I will not give you the entire history of race from, the dawn of time to present, but I will give you some of the tools to understand how we get here, right? And so some of the things we need to think of first is, obviously, those of you who've been to university know that race is a construct, right? And it is one of my least favorite sentences because I feel like people get that and they're like, we're done. Oh, baby, we just started, right? Race is a construct, but as one of my favorite professors, Adele Perry at the University of Manitoba says, yeah, race is constructed, but so are houses, and we still live in them, right? To somehow say that something is constructed does not mean that it's not real, right? And so yes, we live in something that is made up. So is Christmas, but you still want presents, baby, right? So the idea that race is constructed is yet it is still a reality that we live in. So yes, race did not spring from the ground like a weed, but it does also still structure the world around us. Race itself, the contemporary concept of race, as we understand race today, it is not universal and outside of time. Race is actually, if we think about it in historical terms, relatively recent. Our contemporary racial schema really comes into focus and origin around 1500 CE. And it is shaped by 2 twin pillars of historical events. That of global chattel slavery, which really begins about 1440 and goes up until the late 19th century, and that of settler colonialism, which we will talk about at length today, right? These sort of extensive colonization of lands, bodies, and peoples. And to understand the concept of race, we really do have to come into a global capitalist society that emerges post-1500, strengthened through both the reification, the denial of the humanity of peoples of African descent, the turning of them into objects, right? And the simultaneous rendering of the continents of the Americas as open spaces imagined by Europeans for places of settlement, and the peoples that already inhabit them as mere obstacles, or at the very best, children that could be converted, right? So thinking about both how chattel slavery and settler colonialism create the modern contours of race is one thing we're going to talk about today. No, we're not going to do all of it because I'm not a magical wizard, but we're going to do the best that we can. One of the other things we have to think about is, how do these shadows of race, racism, and anti-Blackness explicitly reverberate with us today, right? We are going to also dip into the theoretical work of Afro-pessimism, which talks about the idea that anti-Blackness as a construct for denying humanity. We think about ultimately that 18th century, 17th and 18th century universalized Enlightenment thought was concurrent with slavery. One of the weird things is that people tend to forget that, like, the Enlightenment, all those fun white dudes hanging out thinking, you know, universal principles, was also simultaneously with a period of enslavement and colonization. And as they are theorizing who is human and what the universal is, it is not, you can't separate this out. And so one of the ways in which the universal theorizing of humanity and what human rights are often is predicated upon a denial of the humanity of enslaved peoples. This should be more extraordinarily clear for us as a moment when we think about that we live in a country, those of you who are in the United States, where the founding fathers could make these authoritative documents about all humans having universal rights while also simultaneously making humans property, right? When we could then enshrine a sort of democratic government for we the people, and yet also in the same document say, hey, some of you is 60% people, right? So this is a moment in which universals are predicated upon an anti-Black denial of humanity for some people. Finally, one thing we should think about is that there are hierarchies of man, or as I like to say, lack thereof, right? So this is, of course, a very infamous image that you see here from the types of mankind, right? You have this sort of, you know, human skull, which is this sort of very bootleg version of Michelangelo's David, right? And you're just like, look, it's the white people. And then at the very bottom is the monkeys. And in between is people that look like me. Messy is what this is, right? We're going to talk about these sort of hierarchies of race that get constructed through this history. So what we have to talk about is chattel slavery, right? First off, what does it mean to be a chattel slave? Chattel slavery is a new form of enslavement that emerges in the late 1400s and doesn't really become formalized until the early 1600s. But what it is it is a form of slavery. It is a updated, remixed, modernized version of slavery. And there are differences in the practices between West African and Euro-American models of slavery. So I need you to put this away for when you have that obnoxious uncle at your Thanksgiving table that's like, oh, understand, the Africans were already enslaving people. Why is this like, why are we not blaming them? All right, Uncle Ted, first off, slavery in West Africa was not the same process. And I can say this because I'm a grown professor with a PhD in African history. So one of the things I'd like you to know is that West African history, yes, like many peoples, West African societies prior to 1400 did practice forms of enslavement. However, West African enslavement was explicitly a mechanism designed to respond to low population density, especially in sort of West African coastal regions. What would happen is that through war or raids, people would be captured, but they would then be brought into these neighboring societies. The purpose of enslavement was to bring someone into the community. And yes, let me be very clear, at no point is any kind of enslavement fun, optional, or desirable. So please, again, don't be like, Professor Tallie told me being a slave in West Africa was great. No, but West African slavery did not deny the fundamental humanity of the enslaved person. Instead, they were now at the bottom of the social rung. They were a person very down here, but their children did not inherit slave status. And the whole point was you brought in new people who then could perform, yes, undesired parts of social functions, but also did work and increased the population and did other work. And those people could either purchase their way out, buy their way out, be married, or through marriage, be absorbed into society. This is the type of slavery that existed in West Africa in 1400. Europeans also, let's not get it twisted, did not have some sort of villainous vaudevillian, how do we destroy people type of slavery before 1400. It is a terrifying series of circumstances that combined to create this. Europeans did have slavery. There were in ancient Rome and many other ancient societies had types of enslavement. Again, people could be bought or sold, but they were not things. They always had a human status. They were not property in that they lacked humanity. This is what will happen as a new, horrible, almost like a COVID variant of slavery, right? This sort of way in which it will mutate in this newfound way. And again, when I say this is not to say that there's no causation agent. I don't want you to be like, oh, Professor Tallie said magically nobody did it. No, people made choices, right? But I want you to understand that chattel slavery emerges from these two types. All right, global changes and desires. First off, what we have to do is we have to understand that slavery really revolves around one product that you see me horrifyingly sampling in 2009, which is sugarcane, right? Now, sugar is a product that is extraordinarily desirable and important. I feel like so much of our lives are touched by sugar. Think of the 4 to 15 different types of sugar you've had today. Don't lie. That's right. Now, sugar as a plant makes things more palatable. It makes life better. Yet Europeans did not have sustained access to lengthier types of sugar outside of natural sugars like honeys or other types of things in most of Europe itself. The plant itself is desired increasingly for obvious reasons, especially during the European Crusades to the Near East, where they have increasing access to the plant. There are already plantation complexes in the Eastern Mediterranean where sugar is grown, especially around Cyprus. And so Europeans did have access through these sort of markets where non-racialized forms of slavery, where people who had been captured were forced to work on these sort of slave complexes. However, in 1453, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, fell to the Ottomans, and Istanbul became Constantinople. You may play the song in your head as you see fit. And the sort of access to Eastern Mediterranean sugar declined for Europeans. Europeans instead, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, began expanding out to find new places to grow sugar. The smaller Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal, already by the mid-1400s, were beginning to settle parts of the Canary Islands for sugar growth, right? So this was already a move. It was not unheard of. Just wanted to give you an idea of what Europe looked like in the 1500s. Every state is sort of all over the place, right? It's not a formally unified thing. This gives us an idea that Europe is not just one thing, all right? Transforming the world, right? So what happens is that Portugal takes the lead in this in the early to mid 1400s. By the 1440s, Portugal is on its move, right? It's heading to the Canary Islands. As Portugal is continuously sort of exploring inch by inch, trying to do these things, one reason why Portugal is doing this is, yes, sugar. But the other thing is that Portugal has heard that there are vast gold riches in the interior of West Africa. This is infamous because of the great African leader, Mansa Musa, the leader of Mali, who infamously, on a way of going on the Hajj, on his pilgrimage to Mecca, flossed so hard with the gold mines that he actually depressed the price of gold in Cairo, in Egypt, for 10 years. So he was just basically on a train, making it rain the entire time. So much gold was going out of there that that gold became less valuable. So Portugal hears this, they're like, we got to get ourselves some of this gold. We were looking for more markets for sugar. And so they begin colonizing places like the Canary Islands and Madeira, but they sail around and they find a sort of spot to form a port, like a trade port, and they name it El Mina. Now, originally in Portuguese, this is El Mina, which means the mine, right? They're like, this is how we're going to get gold. However, they do not actually get gold through El Mina. What they tend to do is they get access to local communities who will trade them in gold. The Portuguese will trade other goods. And one of the things that the Portuguese begin to pick up through trade are people, right? These West African societies who have access to people will trade them for goods. These West African societies do not see themselves as trading Africans. There is not a sense of a unified African at this point. They're like, those people we took from that other village over there, and we understand that now they're your responsibility. They do not share the same idea of them becoming property, right? And initially the Portuguese do not either. This is about 100-year process between about 1450 and 1550. And this would have remained slightly regional, right? The Portuguese find uninhabited islands like Sao Tome and Príncipe, and they will take West Africans and they will bring them there and have them grow sugar there, right, by about 1480. However, one of them Portuguese get blown off course in 1500, heads a little bit west, and discovers Brazil, right? Pedro Cabral in 1500 encounters this place of Brazil. Post 1492, they've already begun to encounter these Americas. And so Portugal and later Spain will be like, we have new access to land. Suddenly there's more places to grow sugar, right? So I wanted to give an idea of what this map would look like. So you see as they would begin trading down the coast of West Africa, initially they get blown off course to the west. This is where Brazil is found. And this is the lengthy history that develops. The New World, of course, is part of this, right? As colonization proceeds apace in the Americas, Europeans look for people to enslave, right? First off, the most obvious choice are Native Americans. Indigenous Americans do not have a lot of disease resistances, right? So there is decimation from diseases like smallpox or venereal diseases. Also, if you're capturing people up in their homes to make them work for you, they know where the land is and they will run away from you, right? So there is a sustained practice of indigenous peoples actually helping each other escape, right? They're like, we're not about this life, right? And so Europeans are like, this is difficult. Next, Europeans try to force other Europeans to do this sort of work. Sometimes they do this through indenture, but the initial process of trying to force Europeans to do this does not work. These types of distinctions, when you are in sparsely populated areas, mean that enslaved Europeans will easily fight back against these other ones. And it becomes a larger process of how do you force your own population to work for you like this? So this is becoming, I mean, with the exception of criminals, right? This becomes much a non-starter. So finally, Africans become this sort of concept, right? We have access to this labor market. We have access to this land. And so between about 1480 and 1550, this is where chattel slavery develops. It's not one magical day. There's not one dude named like Bob Chattel who like flips a switch and is like, slaves. No, instead, it is about a century-long process, right? And it's important for us to understand that's how this works. As we think about this, one of the ways in which we must conceive this is through the Middle Passage, right? The Middle Passage is the term in which we think about transport of people across the Atlantic Ocean. And slave ships are floating coffins. People are packed in, as you remember seeing in that initial image, packed in beyond comprehension in these sort of extraordinarily tight spaces. Mortality rates are horrific, right? Disease is rampant. As is depression. Many people will choose to kill themselves rather than submit to this. And even if you make it to the New World, your journey isn't over there. We have two of the most infamous cases are that of the Leusden and the Zong. The Dutch ship, the Leusden in 1738, hits a storm off the coast of Suriname in South America and Dutch Guinea. And the ship hits a shoal and begins to sink, and the captain and its crew, along with 15 enslaved people, are able to escape. And in so doing, as they escape the sinking ship, nail the door so the slave holds shut, explicitly to prevent enslaved peoples from escaping. They said it would be better to let them all die than there to be a slave uprising. And somewhere between 650 and 800 enslaved people are forced to drown in this moment. It's one of the most horrific losses of life ever in sort of a slave ship. Infamously also is the British ship, the Zong, which in 1781 embarks on a little bit of insurance fraud when due to navigational error, they're running low on water and supplies. Rather than supply, inadequate resources to people on the ship, they choose to throw 130 people overboard as a means of eliminating cargo that then would allow them to get it back to port faster. When news makes it back to the metropole, this is a huge sensation, and there is a legal court case about this, and the captain and other crew members are tried and convicted of insurance fraud, not murder, because these are not people, right? And this is the fundamental creation of chattel slavery. It's between 1500 and 1700. It is the devaluation, the dehumanizing of African people. These are the shadows upon which we live. This is the world in which we've inherited, right? This violence, this reality. This trade is conceived of, understood, justified, and made sense of by people. Of course, obviously, our homeboy Chris C, who people seem to really still love, which confuses me. But Christopher Columbus, not only prior to his navigations, to quote unquote discover the New World, had already done sort of these brief coastal trips to West Africa, was familiar with the trade, and actively encourages the enslavement of Africans by the end of his career in the early 1500s. Local sort of Catholic good guy that we like to talk about, Bartolomé de las Casas, is not my favorite. People are like, oh, but he's not that bad. Let me tell you, babies. So first off, in 1516, Bartolomé de las Casas writes a Memorial de Remedios para las Indias, right? And so in the Memorial, one of the things he writes explicitly is he says, indigenous peoples, los indios, have souls. You cannot enslave native peoples. This is garbage. We are not doing Jesus's work by enslaving people. Stop it. However, enslave Africans. What? Bartolome, what are you doing, girl? Right? But like one of the things he says explicitly in the Memorial is, we cannot enslave Indians. Our job to be here is to give them Christ and to lead them into the path. So, but there's these other Africans, so we should do that. Now, in all fairness to Bartolomé de las Casas, what little I want to give him, he does about 20 years later say, oopsie, my B, right? And says this was also wrong. Strangely, Black people also have souls. Thanks for figuring that out after 2 decades, Bartolomé. But one of the things that happens is this is still part of the sort of brick and mortar of building these walls of race, right? As this continues, James Boswell, 200 years later, writes in what has to be my favorite unironic title for a book ever, called No Abolition of Slavery or the Universal Empire of Love. In 1791, writes this quote about Black people. He says, oh yes, the cheerful gang, the Negroes see, perform the task of industry. And in this he argues, quite frankly, that Black people are not human, but actually, slightly above beasts of burden, whose job are to actually alleviate the burdens of those of us who are civilized. And it actually helps them, right? In the same way that we put cages on tomatoes, and we put trellises for plants, so too must we give the Africans labor to put them in some sort of constructive cage to benefit us. Now, we understand that this is a big boat of rank fuckery, but this is also one way in which these sort of concepts get created and recontested, right? And so we see the brick and mortar of race being created this way. All right, finally, for thinking about this, there are cultural justifications and shifts. So slavery in the Americas becomes racialized. Between 1550 and 1650, slaves become explicitly African. Before this, again, we said there were Native American enslaved peoples, there were European enslaved peoples, but through many North American colonies, finally to become a slave means to be Black. And this is formally ensconced after the 1676 rebellion of Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, where a group of European indentured servants and enslaved Africans look around and they're like, are you getting screwed over? I'm getting screwed over. And so they rebel against the governor and begin burning down large swaths of Virginia. In consequence, not only do they punish both groups, they execute many of the enslaved people, and they work to make sure that indentured whites will have something to prevent this alliance from happening again. And that, my sassy friends, is whiteness. By this I mean, if you can create whiteness as a construct, as something to be possessed, as legal historian Cheryl Harris refers to the sort of legal possessive inheritance of whiteness. If you can have something, whiteness means the ability to be shielded from epistemological violence. And by this, I mean you cannot be enslaved. To be white means to be fundamentally safe from enslavement. To be white means that you, no matter how shitty life gets, you cannot be turned into property. You are safe from reification. You cannot be thingified, right? And so this is what happens throughout the late 18th century. And this is sort of followed by many of these southern colonies of Britain doing things like preventing the ability of enslavement ending upon Christian conversion, making sure that enslavement is an inheritable condition, making sure that it is racialized. So the creation of Black people begins here. Now, people had phenotypes before. People have been looking like me and darker for a long time, but they were not Black, right? In that Blackness carried with it these categories. This becomes further justified through use of the Bible, right? Through a back reading of the book of Genesis, they say that that Black people have the curse of Ham, that God intended for them to be servants, so therefore must be dealt with paternalistically. And so what we have is the creation of race and an anti-Black foundation there, right? And by this we mean that we have anti-Blackness and anti-humanity that happens, right? So the limits of human inclusion stop at Blackness, right? And so what historians and other scholars have talked about is that enslavement creates what is known as fungibility. And for those of you who do not go to graduate school, congratulations. Now you've got a big graduate school word, fungibility. Now, fungibility means the ability to be reduced to a replaceable object. If you are fungible, you are like a nut or bolt that can be replaced at whim with something else. That is what fungibility means. And for this process of fungibility for Black people through enslavement, everyone is the same. We can replace them with another. This is what happens through Caribbean enslavement, in that the death rates for enslaved people sometimes is up to 80% within 10 years, within 5 years. There's no reproduction. There's just this idea that new Black people will come. Fungibility is then theorized as the condition of Blackness historically in this world, right? That through colonialism, Black people are rendered not human, but replaceable, right? This is a primary part of the philosophical movement known as Afro-pessimism, a theory that I'm sympathetic to, but not involved in, right? I understand Afro-pessimism, but I'm not an Afro-pessimist. I am a pessimistic African-American, but I'm not an Afro-pessimist. And so this sort of idea of Afro-pessimism agrees that argues that the idea is that Black people are always fundamentally outside of the idea of humanity. Now, that means that there's a long line from Elmina that we can follow to Minneapolis. There's a line from the slave markets of West Africa to Dante Wright, right? There's a line in which certain bodies are rendered unhuman. There's a line in which we can take the initial forms in which policing took place in the Americas, which were slave patrols to reproduce and protect property, and the idea in which some people do not get humanity. The idea in which the police must exist to protect certain people, and people feel safe seeing them, other people do not, right? And so these are the long shadows of violence that through anti-Blackness and racism are understood, right? And that is a quick and dirty understanding of the formation of race, my sweet babies. If you want the rest, you gotta take some African classes with me, right? Section 2. Let us talk about loves, settler colonialism, or a vast superstructure of fuckery. It's more fun if I use my Bridgerton accent because it sounds more. But one of the things we have to think about for settler colonialism is the problem of home and the problem of belonging. Now, I believe that mercifully, one of the things I can say in the 2021 is that this is not shocking, but I'm going to say it anyway. You live, sweet babies, in a settler colonial society. You live in a land that is occupied and is continuously occupied where other people are already living. You live in a nation that is a glorified hostage situation. And let's talk about what we mean by this. We see these two images, right? First off, we see two very patient Indigenous men dealing with some people that are wilding out, right? First off, watching the utterly unimpressed Native American man watching someone celebrating a Native American mascot, you know, wanting to celebrate his sort of particular caricature, or of course this infamous encounter in Washington, DC between a very spoiled young white man from Kentucky and an Indigenous man who's like, why are you like this? One of the things we need to think about is that settler colonialism is the condition of the world that we live in. So let's join in and talk about some fuckery loves. Come on, PowerPoint, don't fail me now. No, we're not gonna. There we go. Okay, so settler colonialism as a concept. This is something that I work on, I teach on, I spend far too much of my life on. For those of you who know me, I'm so sorry. But when I talk about settler colonialism, I hate that I have to use this Australian, but Patrick Wolfe, the late Australian anthropologist, says settler colonialism is when settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. And by this, I want to talk about, we understand relatively well what imperialism is. Imperialism is colonization, right? The going to other people's places, sponsored by nationalism, competing with other national elements through industrialization to get new markets for goods. Settler colonialism then is another, this is the only time I'm going to do equations, babies, I'm so sorry. But settler colonialism then equals imperialism through a European diaspora, but is justified through a nationalist naturalization. The violences of colonialism become nationalized. It is the story of us as a country. It is naturalized as it had to happen, right? It's like basically the seasons changing, right? Which is wild. And as Patrick Wolfe says, the point of settler colonialism is to destroy, to replace, to come up, move in, take your stuff, blow it up, and then say mabi, right, and move in here. I did want to show this. I'm a terrible adult. This is me in New Zealand. I have a full album called Me with Rude Finger Gestures to Queen Victoria Around the World. But settlement, what does it mean to settle? What does it mean to occupy space? You come in and take over spaces. Settler colonialism is different as a process of what I would call extractive colonialism. Don't get it twisted, babies. Settler colonialism is also extractive. It's about taking resources. But I would say, so this is the difference between, say, Canada and Sri Lanka, both of which were British colonies. However, one was conceived of as a colony for European settlement and making home. The other one was a temporary exploitation palooza, right? They're like, we're here to manage these resources and take these things out. What happens is that two categories get created, indigeneity and settlement, right? When people come in and say, this is ours, now people are like, but I'm indigenous, I'm native to this land. And they're like, but I live here, right? Settler colonialism is a type of violence that becomes naturalized. It becomes seen as typical. It becomes seen as we must do this to justify the protection, the advancement of our own people. It is a ethnicized, genocidal formation, right? And the other thing to understand is that settler colonialism is a constant occupation. You are still in a settler society. The fiction of the United States is that after 1776, colonialism ended. But I want you to think about 1776 from a Delaware or a Cherokee or a Huron perspective. These white dudes who are occupying your land and moving in say, no, don't worry, we've changed the flag. It's now a different flag. And you're like, oh, so you're going home? They're like, no, right? And so notice how the actual structure of colonialism didn't end. You just got new flags and better branding, right? So on some level, it is a constant occupation. What does it mean then to live in land that is other people's lands? What does it mean to go to someone's house for a house party, overstay your welcome, stay a whole day, move them into the garage, and then move your whole family in there and live there for generations? That's colonialism, right? The Chickasaw theorist Jody Bird says one of the best ways to think about this, and if you've taken me for Victorian Britain, you know I say this all the time, is the impulse to consolidate the Americas came to depend upon the idea of the lamentable but ungrievable Indian. And this is extraordinarily important, sweet babies of knowledge and learning. The idea that the violence of settlement is lamentable. I feel bad, but it's not grievable. To grieve something would be visceral. It would be inherent, it would be felt, and it would feel like if I grieve a loss, it is a loss that is mine. But you cannot grieve the loss of Indigenous peoples, because if you lose Indigenous peoples, you would have to recognize who did the losing, right? And so it must be something we feel bad about, but it had to happen like the ultimate form of passive voice, right? It was like, it was murdered over there, instead of we are occupying a crime scene, right? So I work on Anglophone settler colonialism. I work specifically on the history of South Africa is what I was trained. But then I work now comparatively between New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and South Africa. Yes, it's very fun because it means that before La Roña, I got to go on planes to fun places and sit in archives for hours, right? But it's also thinking about what are the similarities of living in an active crime scene? What do they share in common, right? And in general, I would like to go in depth with each of these, but I'm not. I'm just going to zip through these because quite frankly, I recognize that we are still sitting through lots of words from my face to yours. And these are other words that we could talk about more at length. So I'm not trying to shortchange settler colonialism, but there's so many spaces. And so I'm going to move through these next slides 100% faster than they will be for you to comprehend. And it is not because I do not love you, but because I want to actually get to the end. So first we'll talk about this and then we'll go to them. The mechanism of settlement. So settlement requires multiple things. First off, genocide. Settler colonialism is genocidal. It requires physical genocide, the killing and removing of Indigenous peoples. But sometimes that genocide is also cultural, as we see here, right? The idea in which our project must be justified through the occupation of these lands because we are making them like us and we are more civilized. We are helping them. We are saving them. We are making them more like us. In turn, European settlers then see themselves as the neo-natives. We are the new natives to this land. And if you think that that's not a sort of thing that applies to you, how many times have you referred to yourself, like those of you, as a California native? Are you Kumeyaay? You Tongva girl? But you say that you a California native. What does that mean, right? Think about these sort of ubiquity of sort of that everyday language, right? I mean, I've caught myself doing this before. I've worked with the amazing California native woman, Deborah Miranda, who we'll talk about at the very end. And one time I was like, well, you know, I'm an LA native. And she was like, really? Show me your ancestry. And I was like, yeah, I know, I fucked that up. Right. So like thinking about the ways in which this is a casual language, and we become the new natives in this land. Exogenous others are people like African Americans, right? Or other immigrants who are brought in against their will, right? So I like to talk about this quote in terms of, this is a South African quote, but it helps us understand sort of the rhetoric of colonialism. So Charles Barter, who is a South African colonist, says very infamously, well, the numerous and powerful tribes that but a century ago inhabited the eastern coast of America. What of the Maori of Australia, the Maori of New Zealand? Fostered and protected by the government with a care almost maternal, they are still slowly, it may be, yet perceptibly and surely, obeying the mysterious law which has ordained that the brown men should disappear before the white, as the snow melts before the rays of an April sun. Wild, right? So thinking about the ways in which this sort of perpetuates the idea that there's no action. It's the ultimate passive voice. I would give this essay a D, right? The idea in which there's no agency here, the people just vanish. And that's the world in which we live in, right? This is what settler colonialism is. So I will zip through these. This is just, I usually talk about Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, but I feel like you won't have to take classes with me to get that. More importantly, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. Belonging is essential to it. We feel like we are part of a community, but that is rendered through conquest. Our identity is often negotiated, and we say things like, we are a nation of immigrants. Not everybody, baby. We immigrated up in this place, but some people were already here, right? All right, section 3, queerness, homophobia, and sexual hierarchies. So, and yes, it was a chance really to put a little Nas X picture in here, so you're welcome. So one of the things I want to talk about today also is that yes, sexuality is a construct, but it does not occur in a vacuum, right? It is not just a thing that happens. Once again, like race, sexuality is made up, right? But it is also, we live in the realness of it, right? So let's go, babies. One of the things we can talk about is that this is a really image that bothers me a lot. These are white South Africans that are protesting anti-gay rhetoric from the monarch of the Zulu nation. They're choosing to protest this by dressing up in what they imagine Zulu people look like. Please never do this, right? This is sort of a way in which like a type of gay protest is actually still a very colonial protest, right? It's no good, it's no good. But for us, understanding sexuality means understanding the history that underlies it. Nothing is neutral. And these histories shape so very much of the way we understand and respond to the world around us. So for the next 5 to 6 minutes, I will give you a crash course.
They're in the bottom.
So here we go. One of the things we have to understand is that the term homosexuality, the concept of not straight people, has a history. The idea of homosexuality or queerness as an identity is relatively recent. Now, let's not get it twisted. People have been having sex, falling in love, doing everything in between with lots of people in infinite combinations throughout history. But this as an identity, as a sense that I am a gay, is new. Being a gay is something that really has only emerged in the late 19th century. As a term, homosexuality first comes into existence in 1869, and then again, finally, formally in 1875. Now, does this mean that there were no gays before 1875? Yes and no. This is a fun question between signifier and signified, right? So when I say signifier, I mean the term. The term homosexuality is new. What it purports to define or claim, homosexuals or the gays, is older, right? It's making a transhistoric claim. These are images, if you take Victorian Britain and the world, we talk a lot about this, the ways in which the homosexual is created as a legal category. Suddenly someone whose sexuality is seen as aberrant, as backward, as dangerous, is formally ensconced legally between 1870 and 1895, starting with the infamous drag performers Bolton and Park, who are very lovely and hilarious, the formalizing of sex acts between men as criminals starting in 1885, and then finally, of course, the a famous trial of Oscar Wilde for indecency and sexuality in 1895, right? These categories are historically created. So again, when we have the philosopher Michel Foucault talks about the idea that someone becomes a homosexual. This starts as a legal medical category. Why are you like this? Why are you doing this? There's a shift from these were sex acts to sex identities. And there are a lot of reasons why. Industrialization and capitalism usually mean that there is a move towards understanding or praising a type of bourgeois gender order that fits in an economic system. And the idea of a compulsory type of monogamy that is retroactively imagined as what everyone has always done. But I will tell you, that's not always been the case, right? Queer theory emerges to think about this in that Judith Butler has said that compulsory heterosexuality, the idea that we are all supposed to be straight, right, becomes first off, straight gets created, right, as this idea in the 19th century as this is what sexuality must be. Now, don't get it twisted again. That doesn't mean that people were not prosecuted or victimized for types of sex acts in the past. But the idea that a type of relationship between people must be of this particular type of body that is seen as the only type of sexually appropriate nature is relatively new in types of its policing. And so the idea is that heterosexuality becomes compulsory. Heterosexuality, and then some ways, as Judith Butler says, becomes an ungrievable loss. The idea that to be straight means that you have cut yourself off from the potential of romantic encounters or loves with so many people, and you can never grieve that loss. I call it the paradox of no homo, right? The idea in which you are never allowed to recognize the thing that you're missing, because that would mean you are now a failed star of The Bachelor, right? You are now no longer able to be a heterosexual. For those of you who aren't familiar, and one of the former stars of The Bachelor came out as a gay. So in addition, theorist Sarah Ahmed talks about the idea in which we are desired to line up in a way in which our bodies resemble those of our parents as a gift, responding to and reflecting their lives and their choices. We are supposed to imitate and respond to our parents as a way of thanking them for the life that they have given us and making them feel like their choices have been important. And those of you who have had any conflicts with your parents should know what that is like, right? I want you to be like this. I don't want this, mom, right? But this is also one way in which heterosexuality is presumed to be passed on. We must reflect this. And so moving off that line is in identifying as queerness is part of that process. All right. These are some very long, sassy quotes. I do love this one because it's very spicy, and I will read it. It's by one of my favorite theorists, Gail Rubin. And so I will read it for you, thinking about how sexuality gets created, and we'll move through some of the other ones very quickly. But nor was the 16th century sodomite a homosexual. In 1631, Mervyn Touche, the Earl of Castlehaven, was tried and executed for sodomy. It is clear from the proceedings that the Earl was not understood by himself or anyone else to be a particular kind of sexual individual. While from the 20th century viewpoint, Lord Castlehaven obviously suffered from psychosexual problems requiring the services of a therapist, from the 17th century viewpoint, he had deliberately broken the law of God and the laws of England and required the simpler services of an executioner. The Earl did not slip into his tightest doublet and waltz down to the nearest gay tavern to mingle with his fellow sodomists. He stayed in his manor house and buggered his servants. Gay self-awareness, gay pubs, the sense of group commonality, and even the term homosexual were not part of the Earl's universe. When she's talking about is in the 17th century, there's no gays, right? There's not gay, we are not gay people, right? One of the things that happens is that we reflect back looking for these histories, and that's important, but also recognizing that a sexual group identity did not exist. Theorist Michel Foucault says out of this, an entire subrace was born, the idea that through European medicalization in the 19th century, the creation of the legal category of homosexual, from this comes the group identity. So through persecution, recognizing these people as medical oddities, right, as problems, instead also means in which people shift and say, but this is who we are now. There can be a sense of community that comes out of that. Through that oppression comes identity. So friends, one question I have to ask is, well, then how does something become queer? What exactly does it mean for something to be queer? And for me, one of the things I think about is from the work of two theorists, Scott Morgenson and Kathy Cohen. Scott Morgenson is a theorist of gender and sexuality who says, we live in a world of modern sexuality, where modernity has told us what is sexual and normal and has been shaped by colonial violence. It's been shaped by occupying lands and spaces, by telling us that certain bodies are accessible. When we think about things like the murders that took place in Atlanta last month, right? In which there are types of ways in which sexual violence historically have been meted to groups of people, and people feel entitled to bodies. This is part of what sexuality has taught us. Kathy Cohen builds upon that to talk about we live in a world that is shaped by heteronormativity, which both localized practices in these institutions, which legitimize and privilege heterosexuality and heterosexual relationships as fundamental and natural within society. One of the questions that I ask myself is, what happens if you fall off that line? Can you be queer? And by this, I mean, can you fail to line up with what is appropriately sexual? Does this mean that you have to be a homosexual? Not necessarily. There are types of sexual acts like polygamy, like certain types of cosplay, like types of BDSM, like types of sexuality that are seen as outside of the norm. And then we must say that that is beyond us. And those can be rendered queer. And I do a lot of work on this, thinking about Native sexuality, right? How they are rendered, and Black sexuality is rendered as fundamentally foreign and wrong to reinforce whiteness, to reinforce white normativity. And I talk about this a lot in Africa and the Western Imagination, if you take my class. So thinking about all of these challenges, sweet babies, first off, I thought we need a Bob's Burgers reference right here. We've gone through a lot of challenges, and this is, of course, the longest part of the whole talk. So congratulations, you've made it through. I believe in you, beautiful wizards. We have the long shadows in our lives that have created these challenges. The larger question now then is, how do we move into understanding how these long shadows shape our belonging? And this is the shortest section, so yay. What does it mean to belong? What is community? What is identity? We all want to belong. We all want to feel like we matter. We all want to feel like we are part of something. We all want to feel like we are making some sort of connection in the world. But these connections are not neutral. These connections sometimes come across as through historical types of violence, right? And so when I think about this, like, we can understand that through violence, we have the creation of the idea of like sort of like gay identity, right? Like in which they've been medicalized, and yet this is also now who we are. But that doesn't mean, say, for example, that you can be a queer person or a gay person and then also not be aware of other types of issues like race, right? So what I want to talk about is sometimes there are problems with belonging. And as theorist James Baldwin pointed out, the problem of belonging can operate on lots of forms. And he says this so well. I think white gay people in the US, he writes this in 1984, feel cheated because they were born in principle into a society in which they were supposed to be safe. The anomaly of their sexuality puts them in danger unexpectedly. The reaction seems to me in direct proportion to the sense of being cheated of the advantages which accrue to white people in a white society. There is an element, it has always seemed to me, of bewilderment and a complaint. Now that may sound very harsh, but the gay world is no such as more prepared to accept Black people than anywhere else in society. It's a very hermetically sealed world with very unattractive features, including racism. If you don't believe me, just go on gay Instagram for about 6 seconds. But more importantly, right, I want to think about, we all want to belong. Belonging is not neutral. Belonging can sometimes come at the expense of others, right? We must also be aware of how we navigate that belonging. And so when I say is that belonging, we can claim space, but also negotiate it. And so one question I want for you to think about, especially those of you beautiful Torero wizards that are with me today, how do we do this? How do we think about belonging in a school that is truly a colonial cosplay theme park? If we understand what settler colonialism is, if we understand what the violence is that create space, what does it mean to occupy spaces and learn in places that specifically are designed to romanticize, normalize, justify, celebrate periods or types of colonial occupation? Does that mean that we throw out the entire school? No, I like my paychecks, babies, please don't do that. But this also, more importantly, we have to live in these tensions, right? We have to think about, what does it mean to belong to an educational community that is founded potentially in inequity or violence, right? What does it mean to take up space? What does it mean to claim spaces, right? And what does it mean to be mindful of the way that we claim spaces, right? So these long shadows cut into our belonging, right? So, hopes. Finally, so we've got the shadows of our challenges, we've got our shadows of our belonging, and now shadows into hopes. As you can tell, I am a full grown up because this is a normal outfit that I would wear. This is rough and wild. Take a minute. We have been talking forever. It's been like 4 to 2 minutes. And we have been talking about how painful, how stressful, how complicated, how messy this is. And yet, if this was the truth, if this was all that it was, I would literally live in a cave and not talk to any of you. I mean, it does sound very attractive, and it has really been what this last year has been, but that's neither here nor there. More importantly, one of the things I have to say about this is complicated. How does this lead to hope? How does this lead to joy? It is so easy to be overwhelmed by all of this. It is so easy to see the rank fuckery of settler colonialism. It is so easy to see the terribleness of the dehumanizing-ness of anti-Black racism. It is so easy to see the structures of violence that create homophobia and make the world hard for people to live in. But where do we go from this? And what do we do? And so I will tell you that I asked 5 very unlikely advisors to lead us out today to think about what do we do with this. And truly, if you know me, this is of course the most obvious combination of people only for me, and no other sane person would do this. The 5 people that we are going to get advice from today are Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, the Apostle Paul, Jose Esteban Munoz, and Kate Bush. So here we go, so we babies. First off, the Black feminist, theorist, activist, badass woman, Audre Lorde, teaches us resiliency. And I want to read this for you to think about what we mean here. In her speech called We Remember the 60s. We must recognize that many of our high expectations of rapid revolutionary change did not in fact occur. And many of the gains that did are now even being dismantled. Now, this is not a reason for despair, nor for rejection of the importance of those years. But we must face with clarity and insight the lessons to be learned from the oversimplification of any struggle for self-awareness and liberation, or we will not rally the force we need to face the multidimensional threats to our survival in the 80s. Where she says, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Malcolm knew this. Martin Luther King Jr. knew this. Our struggles are particular, but we are not alone. We are not perfect, but we are stronger and wiser than the sum of our errors. Black people have been here before us and survived. We can read their lives like signposts on the road and find, as Bernice Regan says so poignantly, that each one of us is here because somebody before us did something to make it possible. Audre Lorde gives us the gift of resiliency. We are not alone. People have been doing this shit before you. Is this shit hard? Is it uncomfy? You know what was also uncomfy? Slavery, right? We have gone through structural violence. We will continue to live. We will continue to push. We have hope. We have meaning. That's what Audre Lorde teaches us. And that we are not the only ones struggling. And we can see each other and see that pain in each other and help lift each other up. Octavia Butler, the science fiction writer, the futurist, the vision, the seer. In her books, The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents, writes to us, the one irresistible force in the universe is change. Everything in the universe changes. Every living thing, every bit of matter, all the energy in the universe changes in some way. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Whether you're a human being, an insect, a microbe, or a stone, this verse is true. Everyone knows on an intellectual level that change is inevitable, but many people don't feel it on an emotional level. And so they create gods, supernatural authority figures to stand between them and change. Big Daddy God, Big Cop God, Big King God. For many people, God is just another name for whatever makes them feel special and protected. Earthseed in this book deals with ongoing reality, not with supernatural authority figures. Please not be like, and then Professor Tallie told us not to believe in God. No, what I'm saying is ultimately, if we are to survive this, if we are to move through, we must recognize that change is happening. History is change. History is charting change over time. Change sucks. Change is horrifying. Change is freeing. Change is what makes me hopeful that I can be better than I was yesterday. Change means that I get up in front of a Zoom and talk to people and try to think that my weird meat brain can actually make a difference. Change is inevitable. Oh my God, I'm using the Apostle Paul. Yes. So one of my favorite verses that I loved very much as growing up evangelical, and now that I am a spicy Lutheran that I love even more still, is Philippians 2:12. I think it's one of the most important verses still. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And I think there's an importance of humility and doing the work. Is when St. Paul the Apostle spoke these words to us, he said, fundamentally, we have to work this out. There are not immediate, easy answers. And more importantly, working something out with fear and trembling is literally one of the most amazing and horrifying things I can think of for this existence. I am afraid all the time. I am highly anxious. I want to make sure that all of this works out and makes sense. I can't control it. But instead, I can, with fear and trembling, try to build alliances, try to work for hope, try to transform the future, and hope that I've done enough, and let that rest. That's what fear and trembling can be and should be. All right, for those of you who are not queer theorists, you're welcome. But Jose Esteban Munoz is one of my favorite thinkers. In his book, Cruising Utopia, he challenged us to think about what is the here and now, what is the future, and how do we occupy it? As Jose Munoz says, the here and now is a prison house. We must strive in the face of the here and now's totalizing rendering of reality to think and feel a then and there, not here and now. Some say that all we have are the pleasures of this moment, but we must never settle for that minimal transport. We must dream and enact new and better pleasures, other ways of being in the world, and ultimately, new worlds. Jose Munoz challenges us to not settle for what is. And he says at one point, queerness is not here yet. Queerness is the warmth that we feel in the future, right? And this is the power of existing towards a now, towards a future. This world sucks. We are structured through so many shadows of violence and oppression. And yet we want to be practical and make sense of this, but we should also dream for a world that is beyond capitalist control. We must dream of a world that is beyond just simple spaces where we must feel like this is what we can eke out. The here and now is a prison. We, instead of just being like, be realistic, be practical. Well, maybe the world that you're trying to be practical for sucks. Maybe we should imagine a better world for all of us in it. And that's what Munoz tells us. And finally, Kate Bush, woo! All right, so Kate Bush, for those of you who are not lucky enough to have listened to the goddess that is Kate Bush, in 1985, she released an album called Hounds of Love. It's one of my favorite songs on it, which is called Cloud Busting. In it, from the perspective of a child who realizes they are no longer able to protect or be protected by their parents, she has this sort of really ironic verse. And so the chorus of the song is called, but every time it rains, you're here in my head, like the sun coming out. I just know that something good is going to happen. And I don't know when, but just saying it could even make it happen. And so bear with me now. The point of what Kate Bush is saying is this. She's writing from the perspective of a child who is hoping for the protection of their parents and who sees their fallibility and yet still hopes that when it rains, like, I know something good will happen. I'm hopeful this will happen. And this gives us here the point of living in attention. What does it mean to say that something good is going to happen when we know so much to be the opposite? When we know, looking at the world, this world is cruel, this world is unkind, it is rife with violence. But what does it mean to look at the world and say, I know that something good is going to happen? It means building on everything that came before. It means rejecting the tyranny of the here and now. It means painfully working out with fear and trembling what we can be. It means embracing change. And it means hoping in the resiliency that we are an inheritance from our ancestors and we are gifting something to the future. Whew, you did it, babies. We'll come to the conclusion. Babies. One of the harshest conclusions I can give you in these long shadows is in your lifetime. First off, in the course of this talk, for sure, and in our lifetime, we are not going to end racism. We're not going to end colonialism. We're not going to end queerphobia. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It doesn't make it not a worthy goal. And it also frees us from feeling responsible for ending thousands of years of history ourselves. You are not going to end racism, babies. But that doesn't mean you can't try. And that doesn't mean you can't find work to do it. So I want to end today with the words of one of my favorite thinkers, the native Californian poet, Deborah Miranda, who speaks of the grief that it means to live in this world. And so I wanted to read this poem and then leave you with sort of thinking about how do we move through that grief. So From her poem, Advice from La Llorona, a found poem. Each grief has its unique side. Choose the one that appeals to you. Go gently. Your body needs energy to repair the amputation. Humor phantom pain. Your brain cells are soaked with salt. Connections fail unexpectedly and often. Ask for help. Receive help, or accept help. Read your grief like the daily newspaper. Headlines may have information you need. Scream, drop kick the garbage can across the street. Don't feel guilty if you have a good time. Don't act as if you haven't been hit by a Mack truck. Do things a little differently, but don't make a lot of changes. Revel in contradiction. Talk to the person who died. Give her a piece of your mind. Try to touch someone at least once a day. Approach grief with determination. Pretend the finish line doesn't keep receding. Lean into the pain. You can't outrun it. There is an ache in grief. There is a fierceness, sweet babies, in survival. There is beauty in the hope we have in this broken world and the long shadows it leaves on us. Now, let's go fuck things up. Thank you for joining me, babies. Questions, concerns, freakouts, thoughts, reactions, snark, poorly repressed childhood trauma.
This may be like an overly weighted question, but I was trying to remember the word for the Slavic countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland. All those areas are really decent examples of social democracies, and a lot of people have said that they're able to achieve that success because they don't have a history of slavery like the majority of the world does. What do you think of that opinion?
Thank you for that spicy question. So to answer your pre-question, that's Scandinavia. And my other spicy response to that is Sweden done enslaved a shit ton of people. Sweden had its own slave castles. So did you, Denmark, looking at you. Also, Denmark, did you own the Virgin Islands until 1917 and sell them to the US? Were they slave islands to see you? So no, right? One of the things that I think that when people render that question, what they're trying to say is like, they don't have this sort of original sin of slavery, but they do, right? There's this sort of collectiveness of it. One of the reasons why social democracy is possible in places like Scandinavia, I would argue, is that there is an ethic of sort of collective care or community in some ways, right? And that's not perfect, right? And I'm not going to valorize it. I feel the same way about Scandinavia that I do about Bernie Sanders, Vermont. Those are very nice places filled with many white people, and I am not from there. So one of the things that I would say is that historically, it's possible, but now we think about that Scandinavia is also struggling in its own ways now that there have been increases of migrants from around the world to think about what inclusion looks like. I think it's easier to sort of see a sort of smugness of like they had it figured out. But as we point out, like this shit is hard and messy and they have their own histories, even though recently for the last 300 years, they've been staying relatively in their lane. They have also benefited from historical processes of violence that have rendered them more capable of sort of moving through the world. So I would argue that there's applicability, but also, and this is a slight loving rebuke to all of my favorite Birkenstock wearing, Bernie Sanders supporting, Subaru driving people in this world, is that we are not Scandinavia. And there's something problematic about imagining or fetishizing that we are. Because who are you erasing when you think about that? And so this sense of thinking that we can be like the United States of IKEA is also a problem, right? And sort of recognizing that there are going to be complicated historical contingencies there. So maybe that's a great question. And also my response, this is why nobody invites historians to dinner parties because we're the worst, is often I get a simple yes or no question. And my response is it's complicated and I can't answer that easily, right? And so I would answer to that is that like, there's so many things happening that that type of social democracy takes place on over multiple levels. And so even if we were to change our system, which we desperately need to do, we're either going to choose a change of the system or we're going to change, like, we're going to choose fire. It's really these two choices. But if we choose to change and sort of adapt, it will not look like Sweden. It will have to look more complicated. Yeah.
You mentioned at the very beginning about studying abroad in South Africa and how then that was like where most of your research is centered on. And I know, I'm sure you could talk about it for like a while, but I'm just curious how that kind of came about and like what from that experience like inspired you, or if it was like kind of other things that led into that. I'm also like a senior anxiously thinking about grad school and the future of academics and all of that. So I think that that's kind of where this is coming from.
That's the gist, Maggie. Okay, so one of the things that happened is that in 2004, I was 20. I don't want to hear that you all were 4. Keep that to yourselves. Now, more importantly, I was filled with youth and hope. And I was an RA at UCSD, and I had a really good gig. I was like, I can just keep doing this. It feels really safe. I'll finish with my double major in history and religion. And then I was like, oh no, but what if 10 years after the end of apartheid, I get to spend 6 months there? And it blew up my whole world. Like, for some of you that know me, like I see you, Melissa, like you remember who I was at that time, like it blew up my world. Because I was like, oh my God, what does it mean to live in a space where that history and that violence and the visceralness of colonialism are so real? And then I came back and I was like, oh wait, so is America, right? And so that blew my brain open in a way that was really useful, right? It was a risk that transformed me to think about, how do we carry these histories within? And if you are a senior right now and you're sort of looking down the last few months, or if you're a junior thinking about your senior year, you do not have to go abroad to sort of have these sort of out of body positive dissociation experiences where you're suddenly like, oh my God, what is happening? You live in a colonial crime scene, and there's so much that can be done to jolt you in that way as well. But for me, it made me think about, what does this process look like, and how do I understand the world from this vantage point that then makes this help make sense? And so I'd say the next 15 years of my life, from 2004 to 2019, were really about, how do I then, from that point of South Africa, transform and think about these issues that I live with? And that did the work for me. And then it evolved me being able to think through that. For you, I would also argue that then there's so many spaces to look inside you and be like, what makes you passionate? What scares you? And also, what do you think the world needs that you can bring to it? And that is a sort of series of questions, start thinking about what graduate life must be. The other thing is, the worst reason to go to graduate school is because it's the next thing. So because you will hate it. It is the worst. Also, once you have finished undergrad, you will be in graduate school and you're like, I don't actually have to do this. I also don't like 50-cent ramen. And also, I don't like poverty cosplay, right? So there's a sense of, you have to figure out why you want to do this. And so thinking about what do you bring to it? It's okay if you don't immediately go into graduate school. I didn't. I did a master's and then I worked for 2 years as a high school teacher, right? And so you will accrue life experiences and desires and passions that will make you, if you choose to go and do what I consider the best poor life choice of graduate school, if you choose to do that, you will bring passion and meaning that will be really good. That's a great question, Maggie.
I have one more question.
What's up, Rachel?
Okay, so this is kind of like a deep one, I guess, but what would you say is your best mechanism of handling the high anxiety that comes with inevitable change?
I love this. I love this question. All right, 2 things. Also, it's really weird to see on this list some people that actually are part of my process for dealing with this. So one of the things you have to do is actively be honest about it and talk it out. You are not capable enough of hiding and figuring it out on your own. If you were, you wouldn't be anxious. And spoiler alert, you are. So one of the things you have to do is you have to actively talk to people about how you're struggling, right? You're like, this shit is huge and I can't do it, right? I literally called a friend last week and I was like, I'm afraid that I'm never gonna stop being thirsty. And they were like, what? And I was like, I know. I'm just thinking about drinking and I don't know how to stop. But what if I'm thirsty? They're like, are you thirsty? It's like, I don't think so. They're like, wow. And I was like, I know. So that's absurd. And yet I am a 37-year-old who is ostensibly in charge of teaching the youth and has a PhD, my God. But the best way of dealing with that change is being honest and open to other people about it, because we are so busy pretending like we have it together. And that's what anxiety is, right? It's like, if I think hard enough, I can fix it. And you can't, right? So sometimes just hearing outside of yourself helps. The other thing is, I'm never going to tell you this, just accept it. No, if I could just accept it, I wouldn't have anxiety. Thank you for not answering my question, right? One of the things is recognizing that you are a poorly constructed, gravity-resistant meat puppet moving through this world, and it is deeply horrifying at all points. And so you cannot rationalize or make sense of it. You have to lean into the fact that it is happening to you, and you have to be okay, not okay with, but recognize that it is really happening. And that is one of the best things that you can do. It's not how do I manage my anxiety? How do I fix it? But this is happening. Oh shit, this is happening. And facing that head on is going to do that for you. And if not, you can blame me.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat.
Ooh, okay, that's a great question. All right, so Rise Diamond, come through, Rise. As someone who recently visited South Africa for the first time in 2019, I pondered social identity, group culture, and impact of colonialism. Do you notice differences between South African race relations and race relations in the US? Please discuss some positive and negative aspects briefly. I love that this felt like an assignment, and I'm here for it. I'm gonna give myself a B+. So one of the things that I would say to this is that settler colonialism structures both of these things. Racial hierarchy structure both of these things. One of the things that's different is that South Africa's white percentage was never more than 10% on a good day, right? As opposed to a white dominant society in the US. It's still white people have the power. Also, the transition is much more recent, right? In terms of 1994, as opposed to insert whatever year in which people like to pretend like we gave full civil rights to people in the US. And so I would say there's a rawness in South Africa in a way that there's perhaps not here. Although by this, I mean in the US, white people have told themselves that it's been 50 years of progress. And occasionally they're allowed to not think about that when another person is killed. So we're still living in this long occupation. What we have is a similarity of types of occupation violence that are happening. I see similarities in terms of these frictions. I see similarities sometimes in terms of like clueless, well-intentioned entitlement from people. I see similarities in terms of hope and optimism and challenge. One of the frustrations that I see is that both of them are locked in sort of types of economic and social structures that may not be immediately fixable. And yet people want them to be fixable today. And so I see this very similarly. And South Africa is one of those places, because of this demographic difference, will mess with your brain. You're like, wait, but what? And that will be very sort of violently powerful, and I would argue deeply productive. So yeah, I hope that helps.
I really love I love Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, and many other people. You said the unlikely advisors. They're my unlikely advisors too. And I like the understanding that, like your conclusion when you said, we're not going to end racism. You know what I mean? We're not going to do those. We're not going to end homophobia. We're not going to end those things, but we can still try to. So what would your advice be to when, for example, when I lose hope in trying to win an uphill battle type of thing, or trying to not so much win, but try to persevere uphill?
First off, you persevered through that sentence, so you did it right there. So yes, but more importantly, I got you. So that's why I ended with that Deborah Miranda poem about grief, right? Advice from La Llorona. Lean into it. Lean into the fact that this sucks and it is impossible. And you are one microaggression away from slapping somebody in the face. Part of this means building community and allies in this struggle. You are not alone. You are not alone. And we are collectively in this. And yet, as Audre Lorde says, this is not a single issue struggle, right? So my struggle is not the same 100% as your struggle, but I can see you. And I can also help you with that burden sometimes. But I don't want to be like, let me fix this, right? I don't want to ever be that person. But I, at the same time, recognize that one way to manage this is recognizing that you are doing the work, and sometimes you got to rest. Sometimes it will feel wildly unhelpful. And sometimes you have to have people that you can talk to. And if you don't at that moment, sometimes you just have to drink water and look at a plant, right? Like you just have to physically not always do it. And because it will still be there, right? That is so horrible. Racism will still be there, but so that means that you can take a break. You can take a break from it, right? Like not from experiencing racism, right? Like I can't fight racism all the time. Sometimes I have to floss. And so like there is that example for me where I had to like just take minutes, and that is, there's no shame in it. You are not fucking up the cause. You are not being a bad activist. You're not being a bad person. Like it is not your job all of the time to fix the structural inadequacies of the world. And if you have been made to feel that way, it's because it's messy oppression. So part of that is holding on to that resiliency and recognizing that your ancestors also didn't end oppression, but they worked to make it more possible for you. And that's one reason why I do the work I do as a professor, because I'm not going to end all of these oppressions. But if I make any one of you feel like maybe I'm not the only one here and I can do this a little bit better, then maybe I've earned my money today, right? Like it's okay. So So you're not alone, boo. And that is okay to always take a break, because that big ass rock will still be there, sweet Sisypha. So you're gonna have to just work on that one step at a time. And it's okay.
All right, can everyone please give a big round of applause again for Dr. TJ Tallie? We would like to thank you again for that absolutely fantastic lecture. We really appreciate you taking the time to prepare and present to us tonight.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the Humanities Center. Thank you, Lindy. Thank you, Rachel, Maggie, and all of you for organizing this too.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Tallie, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us this evening. We hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your night and a healthy, happy, and rewarding rest of your semester.